Hey y'all, it's the first day of November, which means that Election Day is coming our way in the US next Tuesday, November 5th. And for many of us, the right to vote has long been considered one of the cherished freedoms key to American democracy. But voting rights in general were very limited in the founders' time and have changed greatly since then. As one of the more recent changes, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act of 2002, which made sweeping reforms to our nation's voting process. Among other updates, it mandated improvements to our voting systems and voter access, and it established the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, or EAC.
So the Election Assistance Commission is a small federal agency. Not everyone's heard of it. We were charged with a handful of missions. First was to test and certify voting equipment, to serve as a clearinghouse for best practices in election administration, and to provide a number of surveys and research across the elections.
You heard him, y'all. That was the EAC's Commissioner and current Chairman Ben Hovland last October on C-SPAN, explaining the role the EAC plays in our election. And yes, that includes the one that millions of Americans will go to the voting booths for next week. This is Empathy Affect, Forsmarsh Media's podcast that explores the human side of government. I'm Melissa Sosinski, and today we're going to have the opportunity to discuss with Ben how the EAC has been working with state and local election officials to assist them in preparing for Election Day, which is now only 4 days away. He'll walk us through the training, resources, cybersecurity best practices, and certification processes that the EAC provides our country to ensure our elections are smooth, secure, and resilient. So whether you've voted early or plan to vote next week, let's get into the hard work the EAC and its partners are doing to make our votes count. Ben, it's wonderful to have you on Empathy Affect. I know that the elections are right around the corner next week when this show is airing, so it's wonderful to chat with you about how the EAC has been preparing for this really major day.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. It's great to be here.
Now, at the top of the episode, we heard you mention on C-SPAN what the EAC does, and we'll get into that mission work in a second. But I think that a good number of people are on edge about this election. So let's jump in and address the elephant in the room. There's a lot of misinformation about elections, anxiety around election security, and worries about foreign interference. So how has the EAC seen these challenges to our elections evolve recently? What are the top concerns that you and your partners across the country are facing in administering elections?
That's a great question, and you're right that we really have seen the election space evolve in the last several years. Certainly we've seen a lot since 2000, or since the Help America Vote Act passed in 2002, but we've really seen more of that since 2016. Of course, in 2016, we saw Russian interference in our elections, attempts to infiltrate statewide voter registration databases. We saw a real increase in influence efforts and people on social media trying to sow division with Americans and get out false information on our elections. But certainly cybersecurity became a real focus. Again, the nature of nation-state adversaries, that is a level of sophistication and resourcing that requires extra attention. But then in 2020, of course, we had the pandemic, and to their credit, election officials responded to that moment very admirably, really conducted an election during a year with unprecedented sort of challenges and the things that had to be adapted. But we also saw, a real rise in the false and misleading information that year, and particularly in the aftermath of 2020, a lot of people calling into question the integrity of our elections, the accuracy of our elections, and really a lot of focus on pieces of the process that weren't generally talked about. Unfortunately, that has sort of spun out, and you've seen that lead toward sort of abuse of open records laws. You've seen that lead to physical threats and harassment of election officials. And so the environment that we find ourselves in, headed here into just a few days from the November 2024 general election, is one where election officials are facing an array of challenges. To their credit, again, they continue to do amazing work. They continue to step up and take on these challenges. We at the EAC, of course, support them in any way we can. We've seen more work and coordination on the federal level and between a variety of federal agencies to support those officials. But I think at the end of the day, while I am confident in the preparation and work that has gone into 2024 and that the election officials will be able to conduct a free and fair and accurate and secure election in 2024, I do have real concerns on the long term around funding. I think that we really got to see a shift in how we invest in our democracy, particularly, I think, around the information space, understanding that we need to get trusted source information out to people so they really understand the process, understand the safeguards that are in place in order to really, have the confidence that I have in our election system.
Certainly. Just listening to you talk there, you clearly have a passion and a lot of knowledge about elections. Going back to how you were talking about HAVA, the challenges in recent years, not everyone is so versed in the election space. So, what drew you to working in this field in the first place? And what's kept you in it as some of the challenges you just mentioned have evolved and intensified?
Thanks for that question. I think most people in elections, and I'm not different, sort of stumbled into it, or in election administration anyway. I came sort of through the campaigns route a little bit, which was an accident in and of itself, but I worked on a few campaigns and that was not what I wanted to do. So I went to law school, but I couldn't quite kick elections. There was something about it. And after law school, I ended up working at the Missouri Secretary of State's office. There, I really, my portfolio started around ballot initiative litigation, which is a mouthful and a whole separate podcast that I won't go into. But I ended up getting more and more projects that were related to election administration, and it was like, oh, this is something I'm into. This is about serving voters, helping people participate in the process, helping Americans make their voice heard. When I think about the comparison, a lot of the times I think that people, or frankly, a lot of the times it's the same reporters that cover politics, cover election administration. And so I think those get blended in people's minds. And one of the things that I think about election administration is that good election administration is not about politics. It's about good governance and customer service. It's about helping Americans to participate. And that really resonated with me. And I know, talking to election officials around the country, working with them, there's so many of them that I meet and I have no idea what party they are, because their focus is on serving their voters, is on running a good election. And that's first and foremost. That is a bigger deal than anything else. And I think about that too in the polling place. I've been a poll worker a number of times. And when you are a poll worker, you are the customer service face of our democracy. And you're usually paired up in a bipartisan team. But it doesn't matter who someone's there to vote for. It's simply that they're there to vote, and you can help them get through the process. And then, you can thank them and hand them that I voted sticker and be proud that you were able to do something for your community and something for our democracy.
Yeah. Just candidly, I decided to sign up to be a poll worker in my state for the first time for our primary. I'm doing it again for Election Day. And it was really an eye-opening experience. The people I was poll working with were all sorts of faces, ages, people who were there working the long hours and really wanted to serve and make our election happen. So I definitely resonate with a lot of what you're saying there.
That's awesome. Yeah. The first time that I was a poll worker, I was actually already working at the Missouri Secretary of State's office, and I'd been working on some materials for poll workers, and I was like, I want to see what this is all about. So I signed up for a municipal election where we didn't have a role, and it was so eye-opening. Both I understood why we were getting certain calls and some questions, So it was helpful professionally in that regard. But again, it was just the rewarding experience of getting to serve those folks in my community. I've continued to do it whenever I can. My day job doesn't always make that possible, particularly for federal general elections, but it really has been a privilege. And, I think about, I've served first time 18-year-old voters, and you can tell they're a little nervous, and you help them through the process. And I've served voters who'd been voting longer than I'd been alive. And again, maybe at this point in their life, they needed a little extra help, and you get to do that. And they have a positive experience, and they walk out of the polling place feeling good. And again, you got to make that difference in their day and their experience, and serve your community and our democracy in that way.
Absolutely. I think we tend to look a little big picture with elections, but at the end of the day, each election is down to the polling places, the people in our own communities. So just a humble reminder.
I'll take this second to give a shout out too for any listeners that it's probably a bit late for this election cycle, but it's never too late to find out more about serving as a poll worker. The EAC has a website, helpamericavote.gov, that has more information about that and can connect you to your state or local sign up. And again, it's really a great way to see firsthand how our elections are run, be a part of that, serve your community, learn a lot more about the safeguards and the process. So again, check out helpamericavote.gov and find out some more about that.
Awesome. We'll link to it in the show notes for listeners who are interested. I want to take a step back looking at some of those bigger picture challenges around the election that you were mentioning before. We know there are a lot of aspects to election security, but cybersecurity is one component that's been more important in recent years. So can you talk about how election officials enhance cybersecurity and if there are any promising technological advancements in the election space?
Cybersecurity, again, it's always been an area of interest and concern. I think the 2016 election really heightened the focus in this area. And we also saw congressional investment. In 2018, there was $380 million from Congress for HAVA security grants. And in 2020, $425 million. And so as we distributed those around the country, we saw it be used for a number of things. And that ranged from replacing paperless voting equipment. We saw it used to replace or harden statewide voter registration databases, things like multi-factor authentication, which is excellent. We saw it go to a lot of training. So much of that point of entry in cybersecurity, we know it's things like phishing. That's the way that, adversaries get into your system. And so making people aware of that. We've seen a lot of great work around tabletop exercises with election offices working through these different scenarios, thinking through both how they could respond and recover. So much of it is about resilience. We see ransomware all over the country, some in elections, but certainly, all facets of business and government life. That is just a reality of the times we're living in. I think one of the things that has been, a particular challenge is because of the way that elections are decentralized, because we have over 8,000 election jurisdictions that range from, the biggest in LA County, which has got almost 7 million registered voters. Their office has 500 full-time employees dedicated to elections. That's a very different experience than our smaller jurisdictions that run elections at the municipal level, or are where, you may be a township or a village. You might only be one part-time person, or a lot of our rural communities, don't have the resources to have cybersecurity professionals. And so, one of the things that I've really liked seeing in the innovation space has been Illinois pioneered this, but it spread to a number of other states, is a position called cyber navigators. And what these people generally are is they're state employees, but they have regional responsibilities and they provide their expertise and their skills. But they spread that out over a number of counties or jurisdictions. And to me, that's really a great way to recognize the need, but also lean into the decentralized nature of our elections and meet folks where they're at.
On top of the security grants, educational resources, tabletop exercises, and cyber navigators, the EAC also helps certify election systems themselves. And that all starts with something called Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, or VVSG.
The Voluntary Voting System Guidelines are basically a set of standards that voting systems should be built to. And they cover a number of things, and of course, security, but it's also usability and accessibility. And then through our testing and certification program, we certify accredited voting system test laboratories along with our partners from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. They have a program called the National Voluntary Lab Accreditation Program. So first and foremost, you have professional labs that go through a training and certification process just to be able to test this equipment. And then the equipment is tested to this array of things. And again, I mentioned the security element, of course, accuracy. You're running thousands of ballots through, but also there's pieces, I was just actually out at one of the hardware facilities and our hardware lab, and there they're making sure that the equipment won't shock you, or that it won't break if it's bouncing around in the back of a truck, or that it'll run at really hot temperatures or really cold temperatures, testing for all these environmental factors like dust or humidity. All of these things go into testing our voting equipment. Frankly, the same place that tests our voting equipment tests things like satellites and automobiles and planes. So it's really a remarkable investment in making sure that equipment can meet all of these standards.
Now, beyond certifying the systems, the EAC certifies the elections themselves. We need our votes after Election Day to be certified and counted. So if a listener casts their ballot on November 5th, what happens when the polls close? Walk us through how you certify the results.
Yeah, well, I will back up and say that results are certified at the state level, the state and local level. But one of the things that you hear about, or that we talk about all the time, is that election night results are always unofficial. And there's a good reason for that. What you see on election night when you click on the news, those are preliminary results. And those are those early reporting. Sometimes the news will call a race for somebody. Sometimes campaigns concede, again, because they can do the math or they see the numbers there. But the reason that election night results are always unofficial is because there are safeguards and safety measures, and election officials work through that process. There's something called the canvass and certification process, which is essentially an accounting for all of the things that happen. And election officials in that period go through and they do all the math and they add it up and they check everything. We talked about being a poll worker earlier. Sometimes you're a poll worker and at the end of the night, you're off one, you can't quite figure out what happened. You make a note, and the election officials now have to go back and figure out what that was. And, sometimes that's a spoiled ballot got put in an envelope, and they find that and they record it and they document it. But there's other things like provisional ballots. Sometimes provisional ballots, if people have heard of those, sometimes they get a bad name. But those were something else that was required by the Help America Vote Act as a fail-safe to ensure that any American who shows up to a polling place has an opportunity to cast at least a provisional ballot. And then we can figure out, it provides the time to figure out if that person is eligible. And so, sometimes you may have fallen off the voter registration list, or you moved, or, maybe we see states use that around voter identification. If you didn't have proper identification that day, maybe you vote a provisional, and then you can come back and provide that, and they can count your ballot. So you see it used in different ways in different states, but what it basically boils down to is a safeguard to ensure that eligible voters who are able to vote are able to cast that ballot, and then it buys time to ensure that everything can be accounted for before it's ultimately then counted, or not counted if the person was ineligible, if they missed a registration deadline or something of that nature. So election officials work through that. For places that aren't able to pre-process mail ballots, that's something that's been in the news. Again, election officials work through those safeguards. They do the signature verification work, and then ultimately, again, do all of the accounting. They dot the I's, they cross the T's, they double check the math. And then at that point, they present it to an oversight body who then looks at that, reviews that, and then ultimately signs off and certifies the results. And at that point, the election is official.
If you thought that certification process was really involved, you're not wrong. And it takes a lot of training and resources to make sure that elections and their certification run smoothly. The EAC has been helping in this regard, looking to incorporate institutional memory across its training amid recent turnover in the field. Training in polling place accessibility and language accessibility are two big ones. And as the National Clearinghouse for Information on Election Administration, the EAC also trains and promotes best practices in a variety of ways too.
A lot of the work we do, though, is really just highlighting the great work that election officials are doing. We do that in a number of ways, one of which is something called the Clearinghouse Awards, our Clearies. And this lifts up some of the best practices or some of the innovations that we see around the country. Again, with each state running elections a little bit differently, it may not be a perfect fit, but it is likely a good idea that somebody might see and go, oh, I can do that in my state. I can do that in my jurisdiction. And so just highlighting those great ideas to see how it makes a difference. I've heard from a number of jurisdictions, some just last week I was visiting a local office, and actually I was presenting their clery, and they told me about how they'd benefited from another winner. That was a fun full circle experience. But one of the other areas that we've been doing more recently, because of the mis and disinformation that we were talking about earlier, we know that the best source of information is your local election official. State laws do vary when registration deadlines are, when early voting is, if you need an excuse to vote by mail or not. Does your mail or absentee ballot have to be in by election day, or does it just need to be postmarked election day? All those types of things vary across the state and vary across the country. And so getting that information from your local election official is a big deal. But we know a lot of those offices don't have the resources to have dedicated communications professionals, or certainly things like graphic designers. So we've both done a lot of work around providing communications training, but also providing customizable templates. And those range from things like voter education to social media toolkits, again, customizable graphics and text, and alt text, again, to make it accessible, that allow election officials to make their voices louder, to help get more of that trusted source information out to voters. And so one last area that's worth mentioning, thinking about with the recent catastrophic weather events in the news, we've done some training around continuity of operations training, continuity of operations planning. Again, this is something that election officials really excel at. But as we've created those templates and hosted tabletop exercises around there, again, both very good feedback, but also things that people have flagged are like, hey, I know this, I've done this, but maybe I hadn't dusted it off in a little while, or I kept it up in my head. And the reality is I might not be available. And so making sure that people get that information sort of written down and that the office is able to function is critical. And so that's another area that we provided support and training in. But we've launched something recently called the EAC's Learning Lab, which is an online asynchronous training platform that will continue to grow and evolve to meet the demands of the election space and to serve the elections community.
That's fabulous. Just so much that you guys do. I didn't even think about the way that natural disasters could affect elections. I know that they're rampant right now, but usually we think of November as like a pretty calm time. But with the way the environment's going these days, you never know. So thank you for that. You're touching on communications and the training you do that space a little bit. So this may dovetail well. We mentioned before that misinformation and disinformation are still rampant, and many people will probably still question the outcomes of the election, regardless of, what they hear out there. So how are you and your partners preparing for any of those potential consequences, violence or threats? Is communications a big part of it? Is more of the security training you were mentioning part of it? How are you buckling down and getting ready?
There are a number of ways and things that you hit on there. Of course, first and foremost is trying to head that off before you get to a situation like that. I think a lot of the work on providing accurate, trusted source information is a big piece of that. We see a lot of election offices doing things like behind the ballot tours or taking both either guiding physical in-person tours for people or providing those through videos to get a little bit of look at the safeguards and safety measures that we were talking about. We've also, though, seen a lot of work with local law enforcement, thinking through scenarios, and that really can range, again, with things varying across the country with election administration. One of those areas is the role of law enforcement, and you have a range. You have states that require a member of local law enforcement to be there in the polling place, and you have states that prohibit law enforcement from being within a certain parameter unless it's a life or safety issue. And so you have to take that into account. Each jurisdiction, each state has to know and think about their laws and their rules. But also you see that collaboration and that cooperation, again, situations like tabletop exercises, but also walking through scenarios and thinking, okay, if this has happened, of course, this is how, law enforcement would be contacted or coming in. But also, if it's a lesser issue, is there a solution that we could have in place for example, a plainclothes officer who could come in and do de-escalation work? And along those lines, we've seen a lot of offices incorporate de-escalation training into their poll worker training programs. At the EAC, we collaborated on a video with the American Psychological Association on a video that is basically plug and play into poll worker training, and it talks about de-escalation techniques for that individual that might come in and be a little more animated or a little more passionate, and again may just need to just sort of understand the process and again with that customer service mentality, know that you'll answer their questions and address their situation. So I think that again you've seen sort of more planning and preparation go into this, but at the end of the day, a lot of it also stems from having that inaccurate information about elections. So again, I think the more that we can do to promote trusted source information to drive people to their local election officials for that information, the better. And then I think in the long term, we have to really think about, again, I mentioned resources earlier, but how we invest in this area. I think that you see, particularly in the world of social media, you see sort of common election processes, but they're taken out of context or they're not understood. I'll give an example that I remember from 2020. There was a video and it was like, oh, they're filling out ballots here. Well, there's something called ballot duplication. And when that comes into play is, a lot of our military or overseas voters have to return ballots in maybe a different way. Maybe, some places even fax that. That won't work with the equipment. And so you have a bipartisan team who makes a copy of that in a way that can be then fed into the tabulation equipment. Or maybe you have a ballot that got damaged through the mail, or frankly, somebody spilled a cup of coffee on it. and now it needs to be replicated in a way that it can be counted. And so you have a bipartisan team who meticulously go through that, who document it, who keep the original. But if you don't know that, if you haven't seen that before, certainly it could be alarming. And so I think there's a lot of work that we can do to help people understand the process, understand the safeguards that are in place to ensure the accuracy and integrity of our election. And that will go a long way to avoiding some of these scenarios.
Absolutely. And hopefully listeners who are tuning into this have learned a little bit and can feel a little bit more secure too. I want to take some of the end of this interview to sort of just like reflect on bigger picture stuff. You mentioned to me earlier that earlier this year, you were tuned into the Lithuanian election and noticed how similar it was to our own election systems and processes. What drew you to look into the election over there, and how is it making you think about and reflect on the history and evolution of elections in America?
Yeah, it was a great experience. I had gotten invited over to observe that election. It was certainly a privilege to be able to do that. And again, as you noted, a couple things that really stuck out to me. One was that, when I was in that polling place, I was like, oh, the poll workers I worked with, if they spoke Lithuanian, they could totally run this election. It was very similar. It was a very good election. But I also thought about the fact that, we talk about, and I've said this several times throughout this conversation, we talk a lot about how elections are different across the states, and they are. You've got vote by mail states. You've got states that do a lot of early voting. You've got states that are primarily in person on election day. But the thing that is, what it made me think about was the commonalities amongst our states is that no matter what those state laws are, the people who run our elections are professionals. They follow the law as written by their state legislature, and they're transparent about the process. And so those fundamental core pieces of our elections are the same, even if some of the details are different. And I think that's a big deal. The other thing that really I remember as sort of a light bulb moment from that trip was I was sitting around and talking to the other people in the group were from election commissions from other countries. Everybody else was from Eastern Europe. So Estonia and Latvia and Ukraine, Moldova, and Poland. And we were sitting there having a conversation that was just like so many others that I've had with election administrators in the U.S., which was pretty fun, and talking about some of the nuances of elections. But then in that moment, I had a realization that I was the only person in that room that had been born into democracy. All these other people who had dedicated their professional lives, just as I had, to running elections were born into a different system. And it really made me reflect on, I think for many of Americans, this is really all we've ever known. And I think in some ways that can lead to people taking it for granted, for not necessarily realizing how amazing our democracy is and the opportunity that we get to make our voices heard, that we get to choose our leaders. We get to do it in a way that matters and will count. And so, again, I think it was really a reflection on being grateful for what we have, but also the fact that we do need to invest in the infrastructure of our democracy. We need to talk more about the process and procedures, and really invest in voter education so that people do sort of remember what we've got and can have pride in that. Certainly, despite the challenges we have, I wouldn't trade our democracy for anyone else's. It's still the best in the world, in my opinion, and I am so proud of the role we play and the work of our state and local election officials and our nearly 1 million poll workers. And, again, I hope that more Americans can see that and can think about that. And I think any way that we can reflect on that will make a difference in the long run.
Absolutely. It's just a good reminder that our elections are the way they are because of a lot of intention and work that has been put into, making it what it is today. So, final takeaways here. Say I'm a voter about to cast my ballot in a few days. What do you want to tell me as I walk into my polling place and the voting booth to let me know that my vote will count and matter, and that all this work that you and your partners are doing are keeping our elections secure and, the best they can be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one, thank you for voting. I'm glad that you're voting. I'm glad you're there. Hopefully, as you said, if this is the person that's in the polling booth, in the voting booth, they've gotten to the right place. For people who haven't gotten there yet, make that plan to vote. I know this is airing around November 1st, so if you've got a mail ballot at home, you might want to reach out to your local election official and make sure maybe you can drop that off. The post office tells us that you need about 7 days, but maybe you've got early voting opportunities still. If not, you've got election day. That's now the last day to vote. I guess it's always been the last day to vote, but with more people voting early, we really have started to think of it more that way. And what I would say is, again, thinking about what I was talking about earlier, that, it really is a privilege. It is a right in the United States. The men and women who dedicate themselves to this profession, to election administration, do so that Americans can make their voice heard. They do that for 10% turnout municipal elections, which make us a little sad. They do that for high turnout presidential elections, but they do that year round. And they do that so that Americans can make their voices heard, so that Americans can choose our leaders. And you can be a part of that. And I think that a lot of times, I think about this on the news a lot of times, we hear so much about sort of red states or blue states or, this or that. And sometimes people are like, well, why does my vote matter? I know how my state's going to go. And, number one, that may be the case, but a lot of people have sacrificed a lot for you to be able to vote. So I think that's important. But also, it's not just the top of the ticket. You're out there voting, for president, or you're voting for governor or senate, but you're also voting for local offices, people in your community that are going to make a big difference about how your community runs, down to things like potholes or your school board, things that make a difference in your life, in the life of your family and friends. And you have a chance to be a part of that. So please go vote. And then after you voted, thank your poll worker. Thank them for being a part of it. They're people who are just in our community, again, serving their community, serving our democracy. And as a last plug, remember that could be you next time. And you should go to helpamericavote.gov to find out more about being a poll worker.
Absolutely. It's definitely a humbling and rewarding experience for anyone else who's thinking about it. But Ben, thank you so much for this conversation. I know that, before we even sat down for this, the elections, I don't know, just everyone around me is a little on edge, but this grounds me in a great way and just reminds me about the fundamentals about our election and how there's so much work that's being put into it to make it work. And thanks to you, your colleagues, and the many elections officials and administrators across the country.
Thanks, Melissa, for the conversation. It was a great one. And thanks again for being a poll worker. We appreciate it.
Of course. Just a reminder to listeners again that your last day to vote is Tuesday, November 5th. And remember what Ben said, voting is a privilege, so make a plan to vote if you haven't already. You can go to vote.gov and helpamericavote.gov to help make that plan and get more information. And you can check out our show notes if you want easy links to get there. Thanks for tuning in to this special elections episode of Empathy Affect. This marks the end of our second season of the show, but we'll be back in early December to kick off our third season. For those who've been there since the beginning, thanks for sticking along. And for newer listeners, thanks for joining me along the way. Make sure to subscribe and follow to stay up to date when our new season comes out. And if you've enjoyed today's conversation, make sure to rate our show and share with a friend. I hope you'll join me again soon. Thanks, y'all.
Empathy Effect is a product of Forrest Marsh. You can reach us at forrestmarshmedia@forrestmarsh.com with any feedback, questions, or inquiries. If you want to know more about today's guest, are interested in participating with Forrest Marsh, or becoming part of our community, check out our show notes for more information.